Hey there, cats and kitties. I am the Blues Man, Johnny Blues, and this is going to be a brief little discussion video on Psychopaths, episodes 4 and 5. I really found the story spread over these two episodes to be very compelling because, in this very sort of YouTube online world that skirts the edge of virtual reality, it kind of asks the question, if you look at like YouTube as a forerunner to the forum that is depicted in these two episodes of virtual reality avatars, people who have a strong following, and you think of like vloggers and stuff like that on YouTube who are very popular and get thousands of views every day, if they had a virtual face and something happened to them and somebody then continued on using their virtual avatar, would people necessarily detect it? And I think largely the answer might be no, unless there was some, sort of great change in their character or the way they did things or the words they used and stuff like that. Only a certain selective amount of people might detect that. And I think there's a very fascinating side of deductive reasoning because as we see in this episode, the enforcers, specifically Shinya, he really uses that deductive reasoning that all taps into his crime coefficient. And for those who are not familiar with the series, the crime coefficient is dictated by digital sort of analog scans by computers and stuff like that. And it can basically tell the likelihood of whether or not you could commit a crime. People with a high crime coefficient are probably going to commit a crime, and usually they're investigated by the enforcers and the police and such like that. When that crime coefficient rises, they have a process that they can go to counseling and stuff like that to kind of bring it down again. But for those who avoid that, they are going to necessarily become criminals. And so they are basically sought after by the enforcement people. And it's very interesting that the enforcers themselves have high crime coefficients. This allows them to tap into the brain processes of the criminals, thus finding them much more easily. It's kind of like a profiler aesthetic, but in this case, the enforcers by necessity have high crime coefficients, which means at any moment, if they're pushed over the edge, they could just as well become criminals themselves. So that's a constant worry for the main character, Akane, and her boss, Genoza, who basically looks at her as being very sympathetic to the enforcers that are under her. And she specifically sets her sights on Shinya, and I love how in this episode she basically starts off by going to one of these virtual avatars, Talisman, for advice and how to deal with him, and that's basically drawn out through the entire episode, her wanting to be able to be accepting and trusting towards Shinya, the lead enforcer, who is the guy I compared to Spike Spiegel in attitude and style. And so it's quite fitting that she happens upon this avatar and actually goes to it for advice, being that that is sort of the center focus of this whole two-part story. But I think it's even more fascinating when she goes to Tomomi, the other enforcer, who's, very much like the classic noirish gumshoe detective guy. He's been on the force for years, and he's not just an artist, as we see, because he is painting at the beginning, but he's also a philosopher, as we see toward the end. I think it's very interesting that he has certain philosophies and certain philosophical aesthetics imprinted in his mind, as he says, because he's memorized, and he gives a depiction of, two hunters are in the woods, and they are both singularly looking for rabbits. Should they continue to do so, or should they perhaps team up and go for a bigger prey that could be more rewarding for the both of them? And just find this character very fascinating because, again, he is definitely the one who's been around the block, and he is, I think, one of those justifications for Akane, anyway, that leads her to believe these enforcers can be trusted, can be taken under her wing and reasoned with, unlike Genoza, who sees them very much as the dogs on the leash. So a lot of her searching has to do with trying to reconcile her feelings, her conflicting feelings with Shinya as this crime is unfolding, and Shinya's, plodding along and figuring out who is behind it all and everything like that. And once they nab the guy, we're left with three very intriguing revelations. One is very heartening for Akane herself, that being one of her friends from school was actually one of those who was operating one of these virtual avatars, Spooky Boogie, who is this sort of, pirate patch-wearing cat, which of course touches back on the fact that Akane is on a very thin wire, when it comes to her crime coefficient and whether she's relating her brain processes to someone like Shinya and becoming demoted into an enforcer enforcer because of her crime coefficient possibly elevating. And as well as that, there's also the fact that, number one, there is someone sort of a puppet master, if you will, that's higher up than the person they're after. And I'm wondering when that payoff's going to be coming, and if that plays into that whole flash forward that we saw at the very beginning of the first episode, that, again, I called a sort of similar framework to that of Spike Spiegel and Vicious, his arch nemesis' rivalry in Cowboy Bebop. Well, I wonder if that payoff is coming and if that has any relation to this. But also, we have Genosa telling Akane, I worried about a partner of mine a long time ago, and I saw him travel down the same path. And he forwards to her the documents about this, the virtual documents. And we find out that Shinya, who is the lead enforcer, who is that Spike Spiegel type of guy, he was at one time an inspector just like Akane was. And Genosa worries that something could push Akane into that territory, raise her crime coefficient if she keeps thinking along the lines that she is. So it's just very compelling, very awesome. The framework of this series, I love it. It's very much like Ghost in the Shell, as I've related in the past, in the high technology cybercrime stuff that's going on, virtual reality, holographics. I love the technology. I can only hope we can actually have this in our future, And it's going to be really intriguing to see how this all plays out, how this relates to that, once again, flash forward in the very opening of the first episode. I'm wondering who that guy is. I'm wondering what his relationship with Shinya is, and just how much this is going to escalate between these characters, the current enforcers, all of their crime coefficients. Will they all survive? Will they all get their moments to shine? And once again, that relationship between Akane and Genosa. I can only imagine that as things go on, it might get more and more tense if she keeps relating to the enforcers under her, and specifically keeps her sights on Shinya. I mean, could she fall in love with him, and could she end up suffering the same fate he has? So these are all very interesting questions I'll be taking into the following episodes, and I just love it. So I'd love to hear from you guys in the comments below what you are thinking of Psycho Pass if you're watching it, what you thought of this two-part story arc, and otherwise, that's going to be it for me on this one. So I hope you're all doing well, and I'll catch you all later. Peace.